everyone. Thanks a lot for tuning into my talk at DevOps.js Conference 2021. I'm going to be speaking to you about automating React deployments to S3 and CloudFront. The main motivation for doing this talk is there's an increasing shift for development teams to optimize their release cycles for quality software in production. And CI/CD is the automated practice that helps software teams accomplish this. However, building pipelines can be a tedious process if you have to do that manually for multiple environments, as well as time consuming, and it doesn't scale very well, especially when this has to be done over and over again. So in this talk, I want to have a detailed code walkthrough of how to set up a CI/CD pipeline for React applications in AWS. And the CI/CD tooling that I'm going to be using is our code build and code pipeline. Now, the pipeline will pull the source code from a GitHub repository and run tests against that application in the CI stage before deploying it to the S3 bucket, which will then be configured to act as a static site for hosting. And in addition to that, this site will then be distributed using CloudFront and point to the S3 bucket as its origin. So all of the infrastructure that will be built out will be done using Terraform. And in addition to that, I'm going to be making use of a tool called Terragrunt, which is a Terraform wrapper. And it really helps in terms of having a dry approach to actually just programming your infrastructure. And so that will be very helpful. As you see, we won't have as much code in our code base, even for our infrastructure, which will be very helpful. And this is one of the very good practices when it comes to building out resources like this. And so in the end, I will actually demonstrate for you multiple environment deployment streams, as well as the final output of 3 different sites from the same code base. And that is something that will be pretty cool to see once everything comes full circle. Before we go any further, I'm going to start by introducing myself. I am Lukonde Mwila. A lot of people call me Luke. Some people do like to have a little bit of fun and go as far as calling me Skywalker. I'm a senior software engineer at Intellect. I'm also an AWS container hero and am 5 times AWS certified. I currently consult in the financial services sector, primarily working as a cloud and DevOps engineer. Previously, I was involved a lot in application development, both web and mobile, on SaaS products for startups, but I have since transitioned into the more cloud and DevOps space. Right, and so something that I find is very useful, especially when going on these types of journeys, because there's a lot of code that we'll be looking at. It's usually helpful to have a good bird's eye view or a project in a picture. And so I want to just try and encapsulate that with this simple diagram over here and show you what we're actually working towards. I already elaborated on it earlier in the introduction, but this diagram can help summarize all of that. Essentially, we're going to have a pipeline inside AWS, inside the AWS cloud environment. We're going to be using GitHub as our source stage for the pipeline. And for the build and deploy stage, we're going to use code build alone. And code build will run all the necessary commands to actually run tests against our React application. And should the tests pass and we're happy with the quality of that software, then we deploy it. And by deploy, I simply mean copy over the static assets, which are built from the React application into an S3 bucket, which is configured for static site hosting. And then we're also going to have CloudFront, which is our CDN, content delivery network, acting as our distribution point that has the S3 bucket as its origin point. So this will help give you a nice idea of the entire thing that we're actually going to be going through. In addition to that, something that I think is very useful, especially when you have to have a look at a lot of code, is when you actually have the repository on your machine. So you can head over to my GitHub profile. If you head over to the DevOps.js Conference website, you'll see that there is a link provided there to go to my GitHub profile, and it is one of the pinned repositories right on the landing page over there. And it is this one here called Automate React Deployments to S3 and CloudFront. Go ahead and clone that repo. It'll be really useful if you can actually go through the source code as well by yourself, because in this presentation, I will try to focus mostly on the main components of our entire infrastructure and the architecture of everything that we're going to be building out, so that I don't waste your time by going through every little nitty gritty and actually showing you variables as well. We're not going to have the time for that. So I'm going to switch over now to VS Code, and let's get our hands dirty by looking at some actual code. All right, so you'll see over here in the left panel is the folder structure. I'm just going to zoom in one more time just to make sure that's clear. And so you'll see over here inside the root, we've got client application, and this is a basic React application. I will show you the tweak that I made to it. And inside of, and in addition to that, we've got infra live, and this folder is going to contain our Terragrunt configuration files. We'll get to the details of that a little bit later. Over here, we've got infra modules, and this is going to contain the actual modules for our Terraform source code. And modules are simply logical groupings or containers. And I use the word container very loosely over there, not to be confused with processes or Docker containers. Just these are simply logical groupings for resources that are related in some way for a particular set of infrastructure that you want to deploy. And over here is the parent Terragrunt configuration file. So just so you have a good idea of the landscape of the source code and what we're actually going to be working with. And so I'm going to now open this client application. And this is boilerplate code. I used the Create React App CLI tool to create this. You will notice an additional file here called buildspec.yaml. Again, don't worry about that. We'll take a closer look at it later. What I do want to draw your attention to at this point is the app.js file, as well as the app.test.js file. And so inside of our app.js file, let me just collapse that panel over there. The only changes that I've really made is this paragraph over here, and I specify environment and put the name of the environment over there, production. Now, obviously, a great practice to work with over here would be to use environment variables. But the main thing that I'm going for is I want to actually show you how each environment will be sourced to a different branch inside of our repository. And so right now I'm on the master branch. And so the master branch has production over here in this code snippet over here. And I have two other branches. One is UAT, which is for user acceptance testing. And so I replaced that with UAT. And I also have a development environment, which is sourced from the develop branch. And as you can probably guess, I'm making use of develop over there. So those are the only changes. So that'll help you get a better understanding when you do clone the repository and you see 3 different repos. So that way, when we do eventually deploy our infrastructure and we have our site up and running, it will give you a nice view of having multiple environments. And you can see a difference between all 3 of them. Inside app.test.js, over here, I really just tweaked the test. And all that I'm doing is essentially testing that the component called app actually renders correctly. That way we actually get to have a test running inside of our CI stage. I'm going to close those 2 files. Right, so if I can take a step back, I'm assuming you've cloned the repository, but if you want to have an entirely different cycle by yourself, you can go ahead and create a new repo in GitHub. And an important step that you will need to have is you will need to head over to GitHub developer settings and head over to personal access tokens. And over here, you're going to generate an access token. And the reason for that is because you want to give Code Pipeline the relevant permissions to be able to access your GitHub repository. And so this token that you generate is you want to make sure you save it in a secure place. So I'm saving it in Secrets Manager. So you will have to head over to Secrets Manager inside of AWS. At this point, I am assuming that you know that you're working with an AWS account for any of this to work. So head over to the Secrets Manager service. And when it comes to creating a secret, you'll go with the other type of secrets configuration over here, or type rather. And I'm using a fake value over here, so don't get too excited. That is not my personal access token. You can go ahead and give it the name GitHub Personal Access Token or any kind of key, just as long as it's something that you identify, because this is something we will need to specify in our Terraform source code a bit later. And then the value for your personal access token is going to be placed over here. So this is one of the preliminary steps that's very important, because remember, It would be different if our pipeline was making use of a repository inside of code commit, which is an AWS service. But because we're going to an external or third party in this particular case, we want to make sure we have a secure approach to actually sourcing our code from that repository. Right, so get your personal access token sorted and head over to Secrets Manager and store it inside of there. Right, so then now I'm going to turn our attention to some Terraform source code. And as you'll see over here, I've got two modules. One is called CI/CD pipeline, and the other is called web app. And we're going to start off with the web app one. And the web app one actually contains all the source code for the S3 bucket, as well as the CloudFront distribution networking that we want to set up. I'm going to open my main.tf file over here. And this will show you a nice idea or overview of what a module actually looks like in terms of creating one. And so you'll set up the particular source in terms of where all the code lives for this particular module. And I've got mine inside of a folder called front end. And over here, I'm just setting some variables for the environment, the bucket ACL and the bucket name. I'm going to dive deeper now and go inside this front end folder. And the two main things that I want to show you will be the CloudFront distribution and the S3 bucket itself. Like I mentioned earlier on, it would require a lot more time to take you through every single line of code in terms of the variables, et cetera. So I'm going to focus on the main resources that we want to create over here. And so, as you can see, I've got a resource that I'm creating, which is the S3 bucket, and then you can go ahead and give it whatever name. This specifies the type of resource, of course. And inside of here, I give my bucket a name. I define the access control list, which is for the permissions of the bucket. In addition to that, I also have a bucket policy. And in here, I get to define what the rules are in terms of actually accessing the objects inside of that bucket. And because I'm setting it up as for static site hosting, I provide it with the HTML file that will be used for as an index document. And for an error document, I go ahead and use index.html again, because as you know, all the components are injected inside of your root or index.html file when it comes to a React application. So even your 404 page will essentially be a component that gets rendered over there. Versioning your bucket is optional. And it's just a good practice to have a tag for each one of your resources. So I set that up over there. And now I'm going to show you CloudFront. And so for the CloudFront distribution, it's going to take the first thing that is important over here is the property. So we want to set up our origin for this CDN distribution. And I'm pointing it to the S3 bucket that I create. And so this is a reference directly to that. When you give it, you provide it with an origin ID, which in my case is website. And I go ahead and I set up some caching. Now, obviously, this is something that's going to look very different depending on the kind of application that you're setting up. So you don't have to worry too much about this. This is primarily to give you an idea of how you would set it up. But the actual values are something that are going to look different depending on your particular use case. And I make sure that I set it up to redirect to HTTPS. As mentioned before, good practice to have some tags in there. And I also make use of CloudFront's default certificate. Right. So those are the main resources for our actual web app. And let's take a look now at the front end pipeline. And so two main resources when we want to create over here, just collapse this, would be code build and code pipeline. So code pipeline is the service provided by AWS for actual CI/CD tooling. So think of it as the main component over here, and inside of it is where you've got your stages, and you can make use of different services inside of there. And so I'm making use of code build as my CI stage, my continuous integration. And what code build essentially does is it creates a container where you will, with particular configuration that you provide it with in terms of the environment, the tools that you want to have installed inside of it. And so mine is going to be making use of a Node.js environment, as you can imagine, because I'm using a JavaScript application. And so you would provide it with, a lot of it is intuitive information in terms of the name of your code build project. You can specify the type of container. You can provide a custom container if you like for the running of your commands. In addition to that, I provide it with some environment variables. So obviously I do want to specify the environment variable for the particular application. So I do provide that. In addition to that, I specify an environment variable for the S3 bucket destination, because as you'll recall, I mentioned that when the source code is built, or when the React application is built, and I'm going to use the npm build command, that will produce our static contents, and I want to copy all of that content over to the S3 bucket. So this is a nice way of telling your code build project the destination where all that source code should be pushed through to. Then over here, I have my code pipeline, and inside of code pipeline, you'll see that I have my 2 stages, which I mentioned. I also get to specify the names for these particular stages. I've got my source, which, as you can see over here, is a third party. I'm using GitHub for that. And you would provide some very important configuration values over here in terms of the repository name, the particular branch name, and the branch name is something that's obviously going to vary depending on the environment. And I'll show you how you can set that up in a cool way using Terragrunt. And also, as you can see over here, very important is the GitHub token as well. And so that value will be sourced from Secrets Manager, and we can use Terraform to get that in a secure way. Second, over here, for the CI stage or the build stage, I'm using the code build project that I just showed you. And I referenced that over here using the particular name of that code build project. And I just specify the order in which this comes in my particular pipeline. And so this is not a very complex one. It is only 2 stages. So it should be relatively simple for you to set that up. You definitely get more complex ones. And so now if I were to show you the main.tf file, which contains the module for my front-end pipeline, you'll see over here, I'm making use of the data API for Terraform. And this is a really neat way of pulling in some existing sources. And so in here, I'm pulling my secret that I created for GitHub. And this is a really neat way of actually pulling that in and injecting it into some of the resources that you're creating. It keeps it secure. And none of that sensitive information gets leaked in any way. And so over here, similar to the module that I showed you previously, because there are some additional resources that I'm setting up, there are obviously more values to be, or properties rather, to be populated over here. And all of these are just variables. You'll see over here my application name, which I'm using across the project, the S3 bucket destination, the pipeline bucket name, and code build bucket name. In case you're wondering what those are for, these are not related to the S3 bucket for our static site hosting. These are primarily working for caching purposes so that when dependencies are installed on our particular application, when our pipeline is running, that cache will make the things a lot faster in terms of every successive time that the pipeline gets run. Okay. And lastly, we come to the infra live. And over here, you'll see that I've split the folders into the respective environments. And so what we have is a CI/CD pipeline and a web app, just reflecting the modules that we actually have. And I'm also going to open my Terragrunt config file, the parent file, and one of the child files. So the parent file is used to actually generate a provider, and the provider is what we'll obviously make use of to specify the cloud provider that we want to make use of to build out our infrastructure. I specify the region that I want my resources to be built in and the profile that I'm going to be using for that. In addition, you get to specify some additional information in terms of the versions that you want to use for the API. So in this particular case for AWS, what version I want to be making use of, and what version of Terraform that I'm also going to be making use of. And over here, very important, this last block, remote state. And state is what is used to actually keep track of all the resources that have been created or that are live or have been deployed. And so there has to be an optimal way of keeping track of those resources. And so you can have that set up locally or remote. A good practice is to have that set up remotely, because if it's local and something happens to that local file, then you don't have a way of actually keeping track of what's been built out. And so I'm making use of S3 to store a Terraform state file, as you can see over here. And that Terraform state file is essentially a JSON file that contains all the resources that have been built out. In addition, I'm making use of state locking, and my state locking is being done using a DynamoDB table. This is very useful when you're working in a team, because what happens is when you're making use of state locking, it provides a protective approach to having several people working on the same kind of state. And so when one person is deploying something or is in the middle of some kind of execution, then they will essentially, the state will be locked from anyone else acting on that, which is a great protective measure when it comes to working in a team. And so, sorry about that background noise. And now I'm going to show you a child Terragrunt config file over here. And this child Terragrunt config file is for the CI/CD pipeline. The one for the web app or the website will actually look very, very similar. I'm just going to collapse this over here. And inside of it, for the pipeline, I specify the branch name and the environment. And this is a nice way of keeping things dry. Like I mentioned, what Terragrunt essentially offers you is all the CLI steps that you would have in Terraform, but it essentially makes things more streamlined for you with these configuration files, and it runs all of those commands under the hood, and it's essentially a wrapper. Something I do want to draw your attention to over here is this Terraform block, and it points to the particular module that you're going to be deploying resources from. And in addition to that, you can have some common variables, and it will be able to source them from parent folders. So I do have a file called sensitive.tfvars, and it is right. I did not commit it to my repository for good reason. So the sensitive.tfvars file is something that you don't want to have in your repo. It essentially contains variables with very sensitive values that have been set. So that's something that you wouldn't commit. So you just need to be mindful of that when you share a project with other teammates. And so the configuration file for the website itself is not going to look too different. The inputs will vary because, as you'll recall, those modules have different properties that need to get set. And so apart from the variables that you can store inside of the respective module folders, you can set them in this inputs block over here, which is what I'm doing. And that's just a quick overview of our modules as well as our Terragrunt config files. I'm now going to turn your attention over to AWS and just give you a quick view of our pipeline. I'm just going to show you the dev one, though I have built out all three. And as you can see, the resources were created without any running into any particular issues. You can see the source over there is GitHub, which is what we expect. And if you were to click on that, you'll see that the branch is developed, which is what we want for the development environment. And in this build stage over here is making use of code build. And you can click on that to get into the details, and it'll actually show you all the logs when it runs through the different commands and steps. And this great, I'm glad it didn't take too much time. I'm just going to scroll down. You can see installation of dependencies happening over there. And so you'll see this is where it run that test for the application, for the React application. And then I go ahead and build it, and I upload my static content to an S3 bucket, as you can see over there. And so when this runs successfully, as well as using Terraform to build out my CloudFront distributions, they're sourced to the relevant origins, which you can see over here are the S3 bucket URLs for my static site hosting. And you can just click on any one of these distributions and click on the distribution settings to get the relevant domain name, or you can get it right over here. And so, excuse me, I'm going to show you. This is the final output for the development environment. As you can see, environment dev. And if I were to open this one, environment UAT and environment production. And so we get our desired output in the end in terms of having those multiple environments for our React applications. And we've got a streamlined process for deploying these resources. The last thing that I want to show you, which is the most important step when it comes to the React application side, is the build spec YAML file. And this configuration file is what is used to actually tell code build run through these relevant steps. And it's a nice way of actually customizing the container that is going to be running. And so you get to specify the runtime version for that container. In my case, I use Node.js version 12. And you'll see there are not a lot of steps involved over here. And I'm just echoing a couple of things out just to say what I'm doing. And because this repository itself is the one that is being used for the pipeline, I CD into the client application directory, and then I go ahead and install all the relevant dependencies for my React application. And then I echo out the fact that I am executing this build stage for that particular environment. I go ahead and run the React application tests using this command over here, npm test, and I set CI to true. You can optionally add the date for that particular run, and then you can just run npm run build. If you're familiar with React applications, then you'll know some of these commands. And the nice thing is you're essentially taking what you would have locally into the CI stage over here in the cloud. And then lastly, I just mentioned copy all the contents of the build to the destination S3 bucket. You'll recall that in code build, I supplied it with an environment variable for the S3 bucket destination. And so that's what I do. I use the AWS CLI to recursively copy over all of the contents inside the build folder of my React application to the S3 bucket destination. And so this is a really cool setup using Terraform to build out all of your infrastructure in the AWS cloud landscape with the relevant CI/CD tooling to streamline deployments for the respective environments, making use of both Terraform and Terragrunt to have a good approach to your development in the sense of using a dry approach. Otherwise, you would have to run through several under the hood CLI. The same CLI commands that you would be running are then essentially shifted over to being run under the hood by Terragrunt. And that is my talk in a nutshell. It's a lot, but I hope it was very helpful to you and gives you a really good perspective on how you would go about doing something like this. Please go ahead and clone the repository and have a look at it. If you have any issues, feel free to log them on that particular repo, and I'll be more than happy to help you.